And now I give the floor to Antonino Salmeri, Director of Lunar Policy Platform and co-chair of AGSC.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, dear colleagues. It's a pleasure addressing you again this morning in a little bit of a different capacity as a space lawyer and director of the Lunar Policy Platform to talk about legal aspects of lunar environmental protection. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the group of experts and dear colleagues that have been working with me for preparing this presentation and the recommendations we're going to make in a few minutes. Professor Tanya Masson-Swan, Professor Lucien Rapp, Dr. Anne Choquet, Dr. Gabriel Leterre, Christophe Bonal, of course, and Tom Dieteren. What I want to emphasize beyond the great names that you see in this group is the integration of different expertise. So we have a lot of space lawyers in this group, but we also had experts in space debris, such as Christophe. We got Tom Dieteren, who is a high-level diplomat at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and negotiated a treaty on the high seas. And then we got Anne Choquet, who is an expert in Antarctica. We wanted to integrate those perspectives to make proper analogies for lunar environmental protection. Very briefly, what are we going to talk about in the next 10 minutes? We will begin with foundations and the most important questions about space law that apply and are relevant for lunar environmental protection. Then we will discuss what are possible implementation measures to answer these questions and what inspirations do we have in order to prepare good answers. And then we're going to go a little bit into scenarios and proposed solutions that we'll hopefully then get to discuss in the panel that will follow right after. Now, this is a matrix that I developed for my classes when I was teaching in Luxembourg, and it tells you the fundamental principles of space law from the Aerospace Treaty. Now, in 10 minutes, I don't have time to even discuss one of them in detail, but what I wanted to show with this matrix is that there are principles already applicable. Space law is there. We're not operating in a vacuum. And these principles are the foundations that we need to use to develop tools and mechanisms for lunar environmental protection. Michelangelo used to say that he created this masterpiece from the marble. They were already inside. And so the same thing we will need to do with space law. We do already have the potential for creating sculptures, beautiful sculptures, but we just need to carve out the right part of the marble. For specifically lunar environmental protection, we will focus on the two principles that you see emphasized them under Article 9 of the Aerospace Treaty, the principles of due regard, consultation, and non-harmful contamination. The problem with these principles is that only one of them has been implemented so far over the past 50 years of space law, and it's the one that you see in the center, the principle of non-harmful contamination. Beyond that, we still need to understand what each of these principles mean. So due regard is a principle of general international law, and it is understood to mean that activities have to be conducted with due regard to the corresponding interests of other states, which means being mindful. In the law of the sea, the principle of due regard has been interpreted as preventing a state from conducting an activity in a manner that prevents others from doing the same. It means that you need to be acknowledging that there are others and you have to respect their boundaries. The principle of non-harmful contamination has been so far interpreted as forbidding biological contamination of celestial bodies, and it is the legal basis for the COSPA planetary protection guidelines that are extensively implemented all around the world. And finally, the principle of non-harmful interference says that a state that foresees that its activities can potentially harmfully interfere with those of another has to conduct appropriate international consultations. But we do not know exactly what is the difference between a normal interference and a potentially harmful interference. And as well as we do not know exactly what does it mean to conduct international consultation. Are you still prevented from conducting the activity if the consultations fail? Or can you carry on accordingly? We don't know, and we need to answer these questions. But the good news is that we do have tools and mechanisms to implement the principles of space law. But in order to be successful at that, we need to acknowledge that this is a multi-level endeavor. The answer to this question will not fully be in international law as well as in national law. That's why we need to take a look at international guidelines, such as the Coast Guard Planetary Protection Policies, which provide foundational basis a little bit more detailed than the Aerospace Treaty and international law. But then we need to think about what different groups can do in their own program. That's why documents like the Artemis Accords or the future governance principles of the International Lunar Research Station will be important, because they will tell us how selected programs will be conducted in a way that complies with these guidelines and international law. And finally, I would say one part that is often overlooked or misunderstood is national legislation. Because national legislation is fundamental to make sure that private actors can comply with all these international principles, because companies are not subject to international law, and it is the responsibility of states to make sure that they can comply. Now, in order to develop these implementation tools, we also wanted to take a look at regulatory inspirations. These questions are partially unprecedented. We already had to think about how do we govern global commons in a way that is sustainable, responsible, and peaceful. And that happened already in the high seas, and it happened in Antarctica. And as a matter of fact, it happened already with the moon, when the Moon Agreement was negotiated in the 70s. Now, from each of these, we can pick and choose the lessons learned that are more applicable to our case. And very, very briefly, from the high seas, one lesson that we can learn is that there is room for the development of internationally binding rules. For the past 10 years, we thought that international law was dying, that it was not capable of producing new binding rules, but just a couple of months ago, a new treaty on the protection of marine environment has been concluded. And this is a wonderful sign of the fact that with the proper time and processes, international law can continue to develop. From Antarctica, we learned the importance of incremental governance, which means that we can start with fundamental principles, such as the Antarctic Treaty, and evolve them into a system that will develop over time. And from the Moon Agreement, we can select provisions of environmental protection, information sharing, heritage protection that are still very useful and relevant to this day. Why are these important? Because there are some possible negative scenarios that we want to prevent. These are not here yet, but they can happen. Companies on the moon, they can develop carteling behaviors and try to split the moon for themselves. There could be irreversible changes that will compromise fundamental science that we want to do on the moon and beyond. And more practically and realistically in the short term, there can be interference that can then lead to accidents, that can then lead to conflict and tensions. All of this can cause another tragedy of the commons that we want to absolutely avoid on the moon. Now, how do we do that? Obviously, it's not possible to answer this question in 10 minutes, but we do have some ideas, starting points, that again have to be addressed in a multi-level fashion. So it begins with awareness. At the national level, states should require the development of an environmental impact assessment for every activity on the moon. This doesn't mean that you necessarily have to take mitigation measures, but that you need to be aware of the consequences of your action. From consequences to addressing these measures, stay standards of behavior, which simply mean developing a common benchmark that all actors are comfortable in abiding by. It's a minimum level that can then be incremented in the future. And that has to be done in a multi-stakeholder fashion. It's not just governments, it's not just companies, it's both of them in discussion with civil society. And finally, a little bit later on, we can think about notification and area measures. Notification is so important because we need to be aware of what others are doing, especially at the international level. And further on, when there is a significant level of understanding of these activities, we can think about protecting certain areas for heritage or science, and how to manage access to operational areas in a way that avoids harmful interference. So in conclusion, we need to shift our mindset from just passive regulation to environmental governance, which means that first and foremost, we need institutions in place to then develop the rules that we need in time. This has to be done in a multi-level fashion. Like I said, the solution will not be fully at the international or national level. Only if we make them work together, we can succeed. And at the end of the day, as we discussed with the colleagues just a couple of days ago at Thales, this is a balancing act. It's not a question of choosing one over the other. Ideally, we will be able to achieve win-win solutions that balance adaptiveness, because like we all learned today, we need to learn a lot about the moon. There are still of unknowns, and developing regulation in the dark is not a good exercise. But we still need to start somewhere, so we need to be proactive and anticipate which are the priorities we need to address, in what order, and then from there, we can take it forward for the development of regulation. And with that, I will thank you for your attention.